Our next speaker is Evan Balgord, the Executive Director of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. He's an investigative journalist and researcher covering the rise of the new far right and hate groups in Canada. Evan is a fellow of the Munk School of Global Affairs, fellowship in global journalism, and graduated with an Honours Bachelor of Science from the University of Toronto, a double majoring in Psychology and Sociology. He served as a vice president of the Canadian Association of Journalists and is a non-academic affiliate of the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security, and Society. The Canadian Anti-Hate Network, for those who might not be aware, is an independent, nonprofit organization made up of many of Canada's leading experts and researchers on hate groups and hate crimes. Their mandate is to monitor, research, and counter hate groups by providing education and information on those hate groups to the public, to media, to researchers, to courts, law enforcement, elected officials, and community groups. Evan, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'd love to hear from you.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me. That's on a personal level. I've been following the growth of the new far right in Canada for going on 6 years now. And I wanted to share some takeaways that help me understand how we get to the Ottawa occupation and the Convoy today, which is kind of the largest far right populism thing Canada has going on. And when I started this work back in 2016, 2017, the number of individuals that I would peg as being part of Canada's far right movement was much smaller. At the time, they were largely animated by the recent election of Donald Trump and the recent election of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And their rallying cry, though, really was about Muslims. When the government tried to, did do a motion 103, which would condemn Islamophobia, rebel media and many others said that this would criminalize criticism of Islam more broadly. And they started having demonstrations in Toronto and in major cities across Canada. And this is the time when we saw groups like Soldiers of Odin and others taking part. And as a reporter covering it, it became very clear to me early on that this wasn't even really about religion. We'd hear speakers say things like, I don't hate all Muslims, and then in the same breath say, all Muslims are practicing taqiyya, all Muslims are lying to you because they want to take over the country. They obviously didn't get super far with that. M103 passed despite their objections, and they went into a bit of a slump because they lost their lightning rod. At the time, there were maybe 10, 20,000 individuals who were kind of sympathetic with this anti-Muslim, anti-Islam movement. Then came the Yellow Vest movement, actually in France. And there was an anti-austerity protest with many different facets. But the important thing is that they wore yellow vests. Here in Canada, they saw those really heated protests and they started calling themselves Yellow Vest Canada. But from day one, it was all the same individuals and organizations really involved on the ground floor that we were already watching because they were anti-Muslim hate groups. However, because they said, we're not racist, because they called themselves Yellow Vest Canada now, because they said this is also about oil and gas and Western separation, they drew a lot of people into those Facebook groups. And if you joined that Facebook group early on, thinking it was about oil and gas, you'd be subjected to a lot of racism, death threats towards Muslims and the Prime Minister and people of color who are members of his cabinet. And if you raised any objection to that, you'd be kicked out of the group almost immediately, right? So it really became a space where a bunch of people got sucked in thinking it was about oil and gas, perhaps, but then were fed a steady stream of kind of racist and nonsense content. And a lot of those individuals ended up radicalizing themselves. So at this time, there were maybe 250,000 Canadians who were part of these groups. Then came COVID, right? So Yellow Vest Canada actually had its heyday. Its biggest thing was probably its United We Roll convoy. And it was a convoy taking their grievances to Ottawa. It was not particularly successful, but you could look at it as a dry run for what just happened with the occupation of Ottawa. It had the same organizers, several of the same key individuals and propagandists. But back then, their convoy kind of fizzled. They didn't get the number of people they wanted. They didn't have as good of a plan. They didn't actually occupy Ottawa. So the Yellow Vest movement kind of went into a recession until COVID. And when COVID happened, all of the people who already kind of were conspiracy theorists or were racist grabbed onto COVID because, not just cynically, because that's where they can reach the most people, but also because they truly believe the COVID conspiracy theories, right? When that happened, their potential audience for people that they could talk to and reach expanded hugely, right? Expanded to all the Canadians who are kind of vaccine hesitant, who were getting fed misinformation from social media platforms. And that's a huge audience they now had access to. And they took those people and they really turned it into an insurrectionary far-right populist movement. That's how we got the Convoy, right? The main demand of the Convoy, they said, was about this one trucker issue. But then when they arrived in Ottawa and occupied it, they said they wanted all mandates ended. And now they're still carrying on their demonstrations, even though many mandates are ending, because they say that's not enough. They want the politicians put on trial for treason, right? They are looking for a non-democratic change in government. And many of them are looking for those people, when they are put on trial, to be killed. So we have all of these elements. And, you know, people always say, well, aren't you being unfair to the Convoy? And I will say one thing to that, right? Not everybody who is there is necessarily a racist or necessarily wants to do violence, right? But their organizers come out of a far-right movement. A couple of their organizers made very Islamophobic statements in the past about how the Muslim Brotherhood has already infiltrated our politics and is taking over Canada. Others have made other kinds of racist and anti-Semitic statements and saying, you know, these mandates only end when there's with bullets. One of the other organizers, James Bowder, again says Trudeau needs to be tried for treason. So they arrive and they have all of these grievances. So we have a far-right populist movement. And the one thing that I really want to explain here is the takeaway is that in spirit, this is the same issue we were dealing with the anti-Muslim stuff back in 2016 when it was really focused on that. We're dealing with a far-right movement that grows and never shrinks. When people got radicalized during Yellow Vests, those same people became part of the COVID conspiracy movement and the Convoy and the occupation. So the people today who are getting involved in the Convoy and the occupation are ready to be mobilized for whatever the next thing is, you know, whether that's support for Putin and Russia, as we're seeing some people in the Convoy play with supporting. We're not exactly sure what the next thing will be, but there's going to be a lot more people taking part of it. So that's why we're in kind of a dangerous place right now, because we have two dangers that we kind of look at as an organization. We look at very extreme cells of like neo-Nazi terrorists where we're concerned they might go do something. But we're also worried about the far-right populist movement because threats we can't really monitor come out of it, right? The individual, for example, who had his head full of conspiracy theories and rammed his truck into Rideau Hall with a bunch of guns saying he was just there to talk to the prime minister and give him a letter, right? Incidents like that occur organically out of this far-right ecosystem, which has grown so large. So that's why I am more concerned about the broad far-right conspiracy movement, more so than I'm even concerned about the cells of would-be terrorists that we keep an eye on, because we can keep an eye on them. We have a much harder time keeping an eye on a broad-based populist movement. And we did get here largely because of social media, right? The effect of social media cannot be overstated in this. Social media companies knew what they were doing, knew the harms it caused, and did it anyways because it was good for their engagement and how much money they make. So there's a couple things that we can do moving forward to help our situation. One of which is as Heidi was talking about, we need regulation of these social media companies led by government. Right now, the government is still moving forward with an idea of regulating online harms and having some kind of independent regulator to rein in the social media companies to some degree. That's wonderful. And it's an issue we should all be involved in because even though 80% of Canadians support doing something about it, there's a very small but very vocal group of academics in ivory towers who are creating, making it into a big controversy about free speech, when really the number one speech issue today is that hate speech, death threats, rape threats, and things of that nature silence women, people of color, and two-spirited LGBTQ plus individuals. That is the free expression issue of our day, not whether or not a Nazi gets to say everything they want to say on social media. So we need to put that into perspective. We need to be pushing for that online harms legislation to be as good as it could be. But there's only so much we can count on governments and law enforcement to do for us when this really is a societal problem. And the most effective thing I've seen in all of my time doing this is what really demoralizes the far right and suppresses their turnout for events is mass mobilizations against them. And I'll give a good example of this. When a bunch of convoy participants were coming to reinforce the convoy on the second weekend, a pretty spontaneous group of Ottawa residents blockaded them, stopped them from driving in with all their vehicles, talked to them. And then when they agreed to scrape off their decals and surrender their flags, they were allowed to slink off, right? It was a very effective mobilization of just people in a neighborhood. And we've seen other mobilizations, mass mobilizations that have been very effective. The Toronto one was fairly effective as well. Some people drove into Toronto and they wrote back to the convoy group, we were there and everybody was giving us the middle finger and shouting, F you, F you. I've never felt, so attacked in my whole life. This wasn't pleasant. I'm not going to do it again, right? And that's good. Like that kind of all of society condemnation of these far right groups needs to happen because it has a very important effect. The extremists are going to keep doing it, but their supporters are going to be more reluctant to show up with them. So it kind of separates the wheat from the chaff. That lets us keep a closer eye on the extremists, and it means that they won't hit those kind of critical masses they need to turn a protest into a riot or to turn a convoy into an occupation. So that's one of the things that we should be focusing on moving forward, is encouraging these mass mobilizations, mass peaceful mobilizations to disrupt far-right organizing. I have been in meetings with labor leaders over the last couple of weeks, and there seems to be more appetite in getting organizing and boots on the ground to show that condemnation in a well-organized fashion. And that is very encouraging to me because we are sorely bereft of it. But that's the path forward. We can poke the government to do a few things that we very much need them to do around online harms, but we also need to talk about organizing and getting boots on the ground to shout F you and to throw the middle finger at these far right populist groups, because that's part of the bigger solution to it. And I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for including me.